My name is Jasmine, and this is my story. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who had to explain her own worth, but sometimes life forces you into corners you never asked for. I was born into a family that worshipped appearances. My parents believed success was measured in brands, bank accounts, and the type of people you could impress. My older sister, Melissa, was their pride and joy. She was beautiful, poised, and destined to marry into money. My younger brother, Daniel, was the golden child, their charming son who could do no wrong. Then there was me, the middle child who was often overlooked, underestimated, and ridiculed for the path I chose. From the outside, it probably looked like I had failed at life. I didn't flaunt fancy vacations or post luxury handbags online like Melissa did. I didn't drive a car that turned heads like Daniel. I worked quietly, kept to myself, and rarely explained where my money came from. To my siblings, I was the dishwasher sister, the one who didn't fit into their polished narrative. What they never understood was that I wasn't just washing dishes. I was scrubbing away the grime of society in a way they couldn't begin to imagine. But in their world, perception was everything. Melissa was preparing for her big wedding, the event my parents had been waiting for all their lives. She had landed herself a wealthy fiancé from a prestigious family, and the wedding was supposed to be the crown jewel of her existence. The invitations went out, lavish preparations were made, and everything was designed to impress her future in-laws. And then came the moment that cut me deeper than anything before. My name wasn't on the guest list. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Surely Melissa hadn't forgotten her own sister. But then I saw the look in her eyes when I asked about it, the look of pity mixed with disdain. That was when she told me, though not directly, of course, that her future in-laws didn't need to know about the embarrassing sister who spent her life scrubbing dishes for a living. She wanted to present herself as coming from a flawless family, one where every member was polished and perfect. And I didn't make the cut. The worst part was that my parents didn't object. In fact, they quietly agreed with her decision. To them, Melissa's wedding was too important to risk any distractions. I was told not to take it personally. They even tried to spin it as a kindness. Why would I want to attend an event where I might feel out of place? I should have been shattered. But instead, I felt an old fire rekindling inside me. For years, I had been carrying a secret they knew nothing about. While they were busy climbing their shallow ladders, I had been serving my country in ways they couldn't comprehend. For 3 years, I had lived undercover as a federal agent, a Deputy U.S. Marshal embedded in a case that consumed every ounce of my life. I had walked into the darkest corners of humanity, faced down predators, rescued victims, and lived a double life that none of them could imagine. But because I never shared my work, because I let them believe the simple cover story of me working in kitchens, they assumed I was a failure. They assumed I wasn't worth standing beside them in a wedding photo. They assumed wrong. The wedding day was fast approaching, and while they celebrated their perfect lives, I was working one of the most dangerous operations of my career. We were dismantling a trafficking ring that had spread across 3 states, and my team was in the final stages of the sting. The long hours, the exhaustion, the emotional toll, it all weighed on me, but I didn't let it break me. I had seen children pulled out of cages. I had looked into the eyes of women who thought no one was coming for them, and I had been part of the reason they were freed. That was my reality, not the one my family painted for their social circles. Still, when I thought about Melissa's wedding, a part of me ached, not because I wanted to be there, but because I realized how deeply my family had betrayed me. To be erased so effortlessly, to be discarded like I was nothing, made me question why I had ever sought their approval in the first place. But I also knew one thing: appearances can be deceiving, and sometimes the best revenge is simply revealing the truth at the right moment. The opportunity came faster than I expected. The operation wrapped successfully just days before Melissa's wedding. Dozens of lives were saved, arrests were made, and after years of keeping my work hidden, I finally had clearance to step out of the shadows. For the first time, I could wear my badge openly, my uniform visible for the world to see, and that's when it hit me. I had a choice. I could let them continue believing I was a nobody, or I could show them exactly who I had become. The day of the wedding arrived, and while my family thought I'd be absent, I made sure I walked through those doors with my head held high, wearing the very uniform that represented everything I had fought for. I wasn't there to make a scene, but I was no longer going to hide. The moment I entered the grand hall, all eyes turned. Melissa froze mid-sentence. My parents looked like they'd seen a ghost. Daniel's jaw dropped, and I stood there, not as the dishwasher sister they had mocked, but as Deputy U.S. Marshal Jasmine, the woman who had spent years taking down monsters while they obsessed over table settings and wedding photos. And in that silence, I realized something profound. I didn't need their validation anymore. I had already proven my worth, not to them, but to myself, and to the countless people whose lives had been changed because of my work. Still, the story was only beginning. Because what happened after that moment, the whispers, the questions, the shifting faces of shame and disbelief, that was where the real revenge unfolded, and it was sweeter than I could have ever planned. The hush that followed my entrance was heavier than any courtroom silence I had ever endured. I could feel it ripple across the room, a mixture of confusion, curiosity, and shock settling into every face turned toward me. The polished chandeliers reflected against the badge on my chest, making it gleam under the warm light. And for the first time in years, I did not feel invisible in my family's world. I was undeniable. Melissa's perfect smile faltered. Her voice caught halfway through an introduction to her in-laws. Her fiancé's parents, who had been politely nodding, now looked past her, their eyes fixed on me. It wasn't anger or judgment. I saw in them, it was intrigue. They weren't the kind of people easily impressed, but the sight of a U.S. Marshal walking into their family celebration was far from ordinary. My mother's face flushed crimson, a deep embarrassment rolling off her like a wave. She wasn't embarrassed for me, no, she was embarrassed by me. Embarrassed that the lies she and Melissa had spun so carefully had unraveled in a single step. My father sat rigid, his hand tightening around his wine glass as if holding on to control he no longer had. And Daniel, my younger brother, who always thrived on humiliating me, looked suddenly small, his smirk wiped clean from his face. I moved with calm, deliberate steps, not needing to say a word. Every second of silence magnified their shame. I was no longer the outsider who had been scrubbed from the family narrative. I was the disruption to their carefully crafted illusion. I found a seat near the back of the hall, my posture steady, my uniform speaking for me. People whispered. Guests who had never met me before leaned toward one another, asking who I was, why I was here, why the bride and her family looked like they had just been exposed. My sister's in-laws didn't whisper. They stared openly, waiting for answers. The ceremony went on, but Melissa's glow had dimmed. Her every movement seemed tighter, her every word strained. I knew her well enough to see the panic behind her eyes. She had built her identity on status, on being the most admired, and now the attention she craved had shifted to me without me even trying. Later, during the reception, when the speeches were given, my name was carefully avoided. My parents and siblings danced around it, pretending I wasn't there, as if ignoring me would erase the truth I carried on my shoulders. But the in-laws weren't fooled. I overheard them questioning Melissa, their tone laced with suspicion. They wanted to know why she had never mentioned her sister who worked for the federal government. They wanted to know why I had been left out of the family introductions. It was in those hushed exchanges that the revenge began to unfold, not the loud, dramatic kind, but the subtle unraveling of lies. The narrative Melissa had spun about her flawless, high-society family was beginning to fracture. And the irony was delicious. The very sister she had tried to erase was now the one her new in-laws seemed most curious about. As the evening went on, I allowed myself small observations. Melissa's friends, who had once mocked me for being too plain, now approached with hesitant smiles, offering shallow compliments they thought might bridge the years of distance. Daniel avoided me altogether, sulking in the shadows with a glass of champagne, his ego wounded by the shift in attention. My parents barely spoke to me, their pride and plans collapsing under the weight of their own arrogance. I didn't lash out. I didn't make a scene. I didn't need to. My presence alone was enough to dismantle everything they had built on lies. When the music quieted and the evening reached its midpoint, the inevitable happened. Melissa's mother-in-law approached me directly. She was elegant, sharp-eyed, and not the type to waste words. With a polite but firm tone, she asked me about my work. I answered simply, without embellishment, describing the duty of a Deputy U.S. Marshal. I spoke of justice, of protection, of the mission to stand against those who prey on the vulnerable. I didn't reveal details of the cases, but the weight of my words carried enough gravity to draw attention from the nearby guests. And there it was. The moment Melissa had dreaded most. Her in-laws were no longer impressed by her carefully staged perfection. They were moved by the authenticity I embodied. They respected me in a way they had never respected her, and worse, in a way she had never respected me. I caught her watching me from across the room, her expression a mixture of fury and humiliation. She had wanted to erase me to elevate herself, but now the comparison between us was unavoidable, and it wasn't in her favor. For a moment, guilt tried to creep in. This was her wedding, her big day. Shouldn't I have stayed away and let her enjoy it? But the guilt faded quickly, replaced by a deeper truth. I hadn't come here for revenge. I had come to show myself that I was no longer ashamed. The revenge was simply a byproduct of their own lies collapsing under the truth. As the night drew on, I began to feel lighter. The whispers no longer stung, they strengthened me. The stares no longer intimidated me, they validated me. And in that ballroom full of silk gowns and tailored suits, I realized I no longer needed to prove anything to my family. But just when I thought the night had reached its peak of tension, something unexpected happened. Something that would change everything again. One of the guests, a man I didn't recognize, approached me with a strange look in his eyes. He wasn't family, and he wasn't one of Melissa's friends. He leaned close enough that only I could hear, and said something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't about the wedding. It wasn't about my family. It was about the life I had been living in the shadows. And in that instant, I realized my past work might not be as far behind me as I thought. The man's words cut through the music, sharper than any knife I had carried on assignment. He didn't introduce himself, didn't offer congratulations, didn't even smile. All he said was a single sentence, one that told me he knew exactly who I was and what I had done during my years undercover. For a second, the room seemed to tilt. I was no longer standing in a wedding hall filled with champagne and laughter. I was back in a dim warehouse, the stink of fear clinging to the walls, the memory of chains rattling in the dark. My pulse quickened, but my training kicked in. I forced my expression to remain neutral, not giving away the storm inside me. Who was he? How did he know me? More importantly, what did he want? He lingered just long enough to let his words sink in before stepping back into the crowd, blending seamlessly into the sea of suits and dresses. I tracked him with my eyes, but he was careful, never staying in one spot long enough for me to approach. He was a ghost in plain sight, and the fact that he had chosen this place, this night, to reveal himself wasn't a coincidence. While my family and their in-laws were caught up in whispers about my unexpected appearance, I was fighting, a battle no one else could see. The man's presence wasn't about chance. He was sending a message, though I couldn't yet decipher what it was. I knew enough to keep calm. Panicking or chasing him across the room would only draw attention, and the last thing I needed was to turn Melissa's wedding into a public scene of chaos. Still, my mind raced through possibilities. Was he connected to one of the traffickers we had taken down? Was he a relative of someone we had arrested? Or worse, was he part of the network we hadn't fully dismantled? I scanned the crowd again, but this time my eyes also fell on my sister. She was watching me, her jealousy simmering, unaware of the danger that had just entered her perfect evening. She thought my presence was her biggest problem. If only she knew how small her grievances were compared to what might be unfolding in the shadows of her ballroom. I stayed seated, my hand brushing against the inside of my jacket where my badge and sidearm rested. Federal protocol was clear. Off-duty or not, a marshal never truly stopped being one. But I also knew that if I revealed myself any further in this room, I would invite questions no one here was ready for. So I did what years of undercover work had taught me. I waited. I observed. I listened. The man resurfaced briefly near the bar, sipping his drink with deliberate slowness, his eyes flicking toward me like he was daring me to react. I noticed small details. The way his suit hung slightly, loose, the faint scar along his jawline, the subtle stiffness in his posture that hinted at muscle memory from training. He wasn't just some wedding crasher. He had a background, maybe even military or law enforcement. That realization tightened the knot in my stomach. Meanwhile, the reception carried on, oblivious. Melissa and her new husband danced their carefully rehearsed routine, the guests clapped politely, and my parents continued pretending I wasn't sitting a few tables away. They had no idea the night had shifted from a petty family drama to something far more dangerous. Eventually, the man moved closer again, this time drifting near enough that I could catch his reflection in a decorative mirror across the room. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at my family, at Melissa, at Daniel, at my parents. And that's when the reality hit me like a blow. This wasn't about me alone. This was about them. For years, I had kept my two worlds separate. The Jasmine my family dismissed as a failure was never supposed to intersect with the Jasmine who wore a badge and carried a gun. But now, those worlds were colliding in the worst possible way. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just here to rattle me. He was here because of them. Because they were my blood. Because they were leverage. I remembered the way traffickers and criminals always spoke when cornered, their obsession with revenge, their fixation on making the people who stood against them pay. I had accepted those risks when I took the oath, but my family? They hadn't. They were clueless, wrapped up in their superficial battles while darker forces brewed around them. The music swelled again, and as the crowd gathered for another toast, I slipped quietly from my chair, moving toward the edge of the room where I could keep the man in my line of sight. My heart pounded steadily, not with fear, but with focus. This was no longer just about showing my family who I really was. This was about protecting them, even if they didn't deserve it. The man finally left the crowd and stepped outside through the side doors of the hall. I followed at a careful distance, slipping into the cool night air. The muffled music echoed. Behind us, as I pushed through the doorway, the smell of fresh-cut grass replacing the perfume and champagne inside. He stood there waiting, as if he had known I'd come. His eyes locked on mine, and for a moment we stood in silence, two worlds colliding under the dim glow of the outdoor lanterns. And then, with a calmness that made my blood chill, he told me exactly why he was there. He knew my name. He knew my badge number. He knew the cases I had worked, and he wasn't here for me. He was here because someone wanted revenge, and my family was the target. The words hung in the night air, heavier than the music drifting from the ballroom behind me. I had heard threats before, more times than I could count. But this one was different. This one was personal. My family. The same people who had mocked me, rejected me, erased me, were now pawns in someone else's game of vengeance. The man's voice was calm, measured, as if he was reading from a script. He didn't say who had sent him, but he didn't need to. I recognized the tone, the calculated coldness. He was connected to the traffickers we had dismantled, maybe a cousin, maybe a brother, maybe just a hired blade. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he knew exactly how to strike where it would hurt me most. Not at me directly, but at the family I had spent my life trying to protect, even when they never protected me. I kept my face still, my breathing controlled. Fear only fueled men like him. He watched me carefully, as though waiting for a crack to form in my composure. When none did, he gave a slight smirk and melted back into the shadows, leaving me with nothing but his words and the echo of footsteps retreating into the night. I stood there for a moment, the cool air biting against my skin, and realized something. I hadn't admitted until then. I couldn't walk away. Not from this. Not when innocent lives, even arrogant and ungrateful ones, were at stake. My family might have cast me aside, But my oath as a marshal didn't allow me to abandon them, not when I knew danger was closing in. When I returned inside, the reception was in full swing. Melissa was laughing too loudly, trying too hard to regain the spotlight she felt I had stolen. My parents clung to her side, their pride plastered back onto their faces like masks, pretending nothing had shifted. Daniel was already halfway drunk, stumbling through conversations with guests. None of them had the slightest idea that a storm was brewing outside, one aimed directly at them. I scanned the room again, searching for the man, but he had vanished. That didn't ease me. It only made the threat more real. Men like him didn't disappear without reason. He wasn't gone. He was waiting. As the night dragged on, I stayed on edge, positioning myself where I could watch both entrances. The glittering hall, filled with laughter and shallow toasts, felt like a fragile bubble, ready to pop at the slightest touch. Every clink of glass, every shadow by the window, every unfamiliar face made my muscles tense. At one point, Melissa's new in-laws approached me again. They were polite, curious, their questions genuine. They wanted to know about my life, my career, how I had ended up in such a dangerous line of work. I answered briefly, keeping my focus split between them and the room around me. They seemed impressed, and in their eyes, I caught something I hadn't seen in my own family's eyes for years: respect. But it didn't matter. Respect wouldn't keep them safe if the threat was real. My family, on the other hand, avoided me altogether. They didn't want me there, didn't want me stealing attention, didn't want to acknowledge that the daughter they had dismissed as a failure had now become the most talked about person in the room. They couldn't see that their biggest concern wasn't my presence. It was what was waiting just beyond the walls of their perfect celebration. The moment came later in the night, sudden and sharp. A waiter I hadn't noticed before slipped between tables, his movements too practiced, too focused. My instincts screamed at me. I rose quickly, scanning his hands. He wasn't carrying food or drinks. He was carrying something else. I moved faster than thought, weaving between startled guests, my badge flashing as I reached him. In one swift motion, I pulled him aside, pressing him against the wall. Gasps erupted around us, Melissa shrieking. In embarrassment, my parents frozen in horror. They saw only a scene, a disruption. They didn't see what I saw. In his jacket pocket was a small vial, barely visible, filled with a clear liquid. Poison. The room spun with confusion, voices overlapping, accusations flying. Melissa demanded to know what I was doing, her face twisted. With rage, my parents begged me to stop humiliating them. Daniel stumbled forward, calling me paranoid. They all thought I was making a spectacle to upstage the wedding. But then the man's mask slipped. His eyes, cold and sharp, met mine, and in that instant I knew he was no waiter. He was the threat. The vial was real. The danger was real. Security rushed over, guests whispering, panic simmering beneath the surface. I flashed my badge, my voice steady and firm, ordering them to detain him. The whispers grew louder, shock spreading across the room. The perfect wedding had just turned into a crime scene, and still, even in that moment, my family didn't thank me. They didn't realize I had just saved them. All they saw was their precious image shattering in front of wealthy strangers. Melissa's face burned with hatred as she screamed that I had ruined her wedding. My parents glared at me, their shame twisting into blame. Daniel cursed under his breath, accusing me of seeking attention. None of them understood that without me, their story might have ended that night. As the imposter was dragged away, his cold smirk never fading, I realized the night wasn't over. He wasn't working alone. He had been planted there to send a message. And whoever had orchestrated this wouldn't stop until their revenge was complete. My family still despised me. They still rejected me. But like it or not, I was the only shield standing between them and the danger they couldn't even see. And I wasn't about to let them fall, no matter how undeserving they were. The ballroom had erupted into chaos. Security escorted the imposter waiter out, but his smirk lingered in my mind, a chilling reminder that this was not the end. He hadn't come alone. He was the warning shot. The real storm was still on its way. Melissa was hysterical, her perfect makeup streaking as she shrieked that I had ruined everything. Her new husband stood awkwardly beside her, unsure whether to defend her or try to salvage the night. My parents were pale, rigid, trying desperately to soothe the in-laws, assuring them this was just some unfortunate misunderstanding. And Daniel just poured himself another drink, muttering insults under his breath about how I always needed to make things about me. I should have felt anger. I should have shouted back. But instead, I felt something else. Clarity. Their pettiness, their shallow desperation to cling to appearances was meaningless in the face of what we were dealing with. They were children dressing in grown-up clothes, blind to the wolves circling just beyond their fragile walls. I pulled aside the lead security officer, showing him my badge again, and spoke quietly but firmly. The building needed to be locked down. No one in or out without clearance. At first, he hesitated. This was a wedding, not a federal operation. But the seriousness in my voice convinced him. Still, the damage was done. Guests were unsettled, whispers flying through the crowd like wildfire. Melissa's in-laws looked at her with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Their perfect image of her family was cracking, and she blamed me for every splinter. As the room simmered with unease, I stepped outside again, needing a breath of cold night air to steady myself. That's when I saw him, the same man who had confronted me earlier. He stood at the far end of the garden, leaning casually against the stone wall as if he had all the time in the world. His calmness was infuriating. I walked toward him, every step deliberate, my senses sharp. When I reached him, he didn't flinch. He just tilted his head, studying me the way predators study prey. He told me what I already knew. The traffickers we had taken down had allies, and those allies had money, connections, and patience. They hadn't forgotten me. They hadn't forgiven me. And they had discovered my greatest vulnerability, my family. I asked him what he wanted. He didn't demand money. He didn't demand freedom for the ones in prison. No, his demand was far crueler. He wanted me to watch as they destroyed the people I loved, the people who had betrayed me, until I understood what it felt like to lose everything. And then he slipped away into the shadows, leaving me with the weight of his promise. Inside, the celebration had crumbled. Melissa was locked in a screaming match with her husband, my parents were trying and failing to smooth things over, and Daniel was slumped in a chair, glassy-eyed and useless. None of them even noticed me return. None of them cared that I was the only reason the night hadn't ended in tragedy already. But as much as their hatred stung, I couldn't abandon them. Not now. I moved quietly through the crowd, scanning every corner, every doorway, every unfamiliar face. Years of undercover work had trained me to notice the smallest details. A nervous glance, a hand too close to a jacket pocket, a step out, of rhythm with the music. My instincts screamed at me again. The danger wasn't gone, it was closer. And then it happened. One of the side doors burst open, and 3 men in dark suits stepped inside. They weren't guests, they weren't staff. They moved with precision, their eyes sweeping the room in practiced unison. Time slowed. I saw it all at once, the panic blooming across the faces of the guests, Melissa clutching her husband in confusion, my parents frozen with fear, Daniel fumbling to stand, and the 3 men spreading out, positioning themselves with chilling coordination. I moved without thinking. My weapon was drawn, my badge raised, my voice commanding the room to freeze. Screams erupted, chairs toppled. The illusion of a perfect wedding shattered completely. The men didn't flinch. One of them pulled a weapon, and the crack of a gunshot split the air, glass shattered, people screamed louder. My family ducked behind a table, their fear palpable now, raw and real. I fired back, my training guiding me, every movement precise. Security rushed to help, but they were no match for men like these. This wasn't chaos. It was a calculated strike. They weren't here to rob. They weren't here to scare. They were here for blood. The fight was fast and brutal. My body moved. On instinct, adrenaline sharpening every sense. Within minutes, 2 of the men were down, the 3rd restrained. The ballroom was a war zone of broken glass and overturned tables, guests cowering in the corners. And in the aftermath, when the gunfire ceased and the silence returned, My family finally looked at me, not with disdain, not with embarrassment, but with something else entirely. Fear. Not fear of me, but fear for what I had just protected them from. For the first time, they saw the world I lived in, the darkness I fought against, the danger that followed me like a shadow, and in their eyes, I saw something I had never seen before. Not love, not gratitude, but the faintest flicker of respect. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it was something. As the intruders were dragged away, I holstered my weapon, my chest heaving with controlled breaths. The guests whispered, shaken, and wide-eyed. Melissa's in-laws looked at me with awe, but Melissa herself stared at me with a mixture of anger and something else, resentment that even in her moment of triumph, I had become the center of the story. But she didn't understand. None of them did. This wasn't over. The threat wasn't gone. And the man in the shadows, the one who had orchestrated this, was still out there, watching, waiting. And I knew he wouldn't stop until he had taken everything from me. The ballroom smelled of smoke and fear, the aftermath of violence clinging to the air even as staff scrambled to clean shattered glass and usher terrified guests out. The wedding was over, though no one dared say it aloud. The music had died. The lights seemed harsher, and the fairy tale Melissa had tried to stage had collapsed into a nightmare, but I knew it wasn't finished. The 3 men who had stormed the hall were soldiers, not masterminds. The man in the shadows, the one who had warned me, taunted me, was still out there. He had made it clear this was personal, and people like him didn't stop until their point was made in blood. As federal officers arrived to take custody of the attackers, I stepped outside again, my senses on high alert. The night was too quiet, the garden too still. My hand hovered near my weapon, my badge still clipped to my chest. Every nerve in my body screamed that he was close. And then I saw him. He stood at the far end of the path, just beyond the glow of the lanterns, his hands clasped behind his back as though this was nothing more than a casual stroll. His composure was chilling, his calmness deliberate. He wanted me to see him, to know he hadn't run, to know he was in control. I walked toward him, every step steady, my breathing even. He watched me without flinching, his gaze sharp, predatory. When I stopped just a few feet away, he finally spoke. His words were venom wrapped in silk. He told me I had destroyed lives when I dismantled their operation. That the men I had locked away weren't just criminals to him. They were family, friends, brothers. And now he intended to return the favor by destroying mine. I let him talk. Men like him thrived on the sound of their own threats, believing fear gave them power. But as his words poured out, I felt something shift inside me. For years, I had carried the shame of my family's rejection like a weight. For years, I had hidden who I really was, letting them believe I was nothing. But now, with him standing there, I realized something profound. I wasn't fighting for their approval anymore. I wasn't even fighting for their safety. I was fighting because this was who I was. Because protecting people, even those who didn't deserve it, was the oath I had taken, the life I had chosen, the purpose that gave me worth. When he finally fell silent, waiting for me to crack, I drew my weapon. My voice was steady, my badge glinting in the dim light. I told him it ended here. The smirk faded from his face. He lunged. The fight was fast and brutal, a blur of fists and fury under the cold night sky. He was strong, trained, but so was I. Every strike was fueled by the lives I had saved, the monsters I had stopped, the oath I had sworn. Every block, every counter, was a reminder that I had faced worse than him in darker places than this. At last, I pinned him to the ground, my weapon pressed against him, my breath ragged but controlled. His defiance flickered, replaced by the first trace of fear. The sirens wailed in the distance as federal backup closed in, and I knew this was over. He was taken into custody, his threats silenced for now. The danger had passed, but the echoes of it lingered. When I walked back inside, the ballroom was nearly empty. My family stood huddled together, pale and shaken, their perfect image shattered beyond repair. For the first time in my life, they looked at me not as the dishwasher sister, but as something else entirely. A protector, a survivor, someone they couldn't dismiss anymore. Melissa's eyes were filled with tears, but not gratitude, resentment. She would never forgive me for stealing the spotlight on her wedding day. Daniel couldn't meet my gaze, shame flickering across his face. My parents tried to speak, their voices weak, but I raised a hand and stopped them, because I finally understood. Didn't need their thanks. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their love. I had spent years thinking I was less because of them, because of the way they looked at me, the way they whispered about me. But tonight, watching their shallow world crumble while I stood tall in mine, I realized I had already won. Not because they now knew the truth, but because I no longer needed them to. I turned away from them, my head high, my uniform heavy on my shoulders but light in my heart. I wasn't the forgotten sister anymore. I wasn't the family's shame. I was Deputy U.S. Marshal Jasmine, a woman who had faced monsters and refused to bow to them. As I walked out of that shattered wedding, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. The revenge wasn't in their shame. It wasn't in their whispers. It was in my realization that their shallow approval had never mattered. I had already found my worth in something far greater than their empty expectations. And for the first time, I didn't look back.